Hello, I'm Marc Neesam. I'm Head of Professional Development Solutions at Cambridge Partnership for Education, and I'm joined today by Jill Healey and Colin Haikin from ChildHope. Jill is the Executive Director and leads the work of ChildHope. Colin is ChildHope's Education Advisor and has been working on their Girls Education Challenge project in Ethiopia. First of all, welcome. And Jill, if you're able to, can you give us a quick overview of ChildHope and what your mission?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, ChildHope has been in operation since 1989. We focus on working with highly marginalised children. Many of the children we work with are either living and working on the streets or involved in some way in highly exploitative, worse forms of child labour. At the moment, we currently work in Africa and Asia. And over the years, we've built up expertise in child protection and safeguarding. It's a specialist area of ChildHope's now. But what we also find is that with all the partners and programs and partnerships we develop, there's always an education focus. And that may be formal education or less formal, but there's always some connection with education. So safeguarding, child protection and education are areas very close to ChildHope's heart.
And welcome, Colin, as well. I'm really pleased to be joined by you today because we're going to be having a good conversation, a discussion around safeguarding in relationship with professional development. So I'm really pleased that that you're here from ChildHope to talk about that. Just for a bit of context, it's worth just saying that the reason for this conversation is the COVID-19 pandemic has had a dramatic impact on education systems around the world. Schools for all ages have been closed in multiple countries, potentially every country in the world at some point, with some closed still as we speak. And hundreds of millions of children have spent more time at home or in their local community. Ongoing analysis by multiple organisations, including UNICEF and ChildHope, has identified that alongside learning, there's been greater safety risks for children. A UNICEF working paper from July 2020 reviewing international literature in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic on the impact of pandemics and epidemics on child protection highlighted how pandemics in general increase the risk of child marriage, sexual abuse, violence and exploitation. The mental health of children, partly due to this increase in physical abuse and physical risk, is also at risk. But it's also because there's been a loss of support networks which are provided by schools and children being increasingly expected to support home life, coupled with being faced with the increased chance of having death in their family due to COVID, potentially of their caregivers, which may even result in orphanhood for some of the children in the education system. All of these issues existed before the pandemic, but the pandemic in many ways, right now has exacerbated the situation for children due to the scale and length of the disruption they're facing. And these children most at risk will hopefully return to school, although we recognise it's already been identified that many might be lost to education, and there's a different issue around that. And when children do return to school, it's going to place schools and teachers in a position to identify and support those children whose safety and well-being have been at risk or continue to be at risk. And there's going to be a role for schools and teachers in supporting them. Professional development is going to be part of the solution. So I think that's particularly why we're here today, to talk about this increased risk from the pandemic, but also historical that's been in existence, and the role that professional development can have in resolving that, or supporting teachers in resolving that. So I'm going to jump right in with sort of a big question. So given the context and the history of all this, what are some of the challenges of improving teacher awareness of child wellbeing and safeguarding in the first place? Because you only have these children come back, how do we support them with their awareness of the problem?
Shall I start with that one? Thank you. I will probably talk more broadly in this conversation, and Colin will focus in more to education and teacher development. But just to say a few things about some of the challenges around raising awareness of safeguarding and related issues more widely. I think one of the challenges is the terminology itself. The term safeguarding can be incredibly it can create some problems. People, especially as it tends to, the terminology has kind of been introduced more heavily more recently since 2018, and some of the issues that some international NGOs faced around safeguarding and issues of safety. And so safeguarding suddenly became a term, and it doesn't even translate in some languages. So it can be a problem, and people can spend more time asking, what does it mean? What's the definition of safeguarding? What are the expectations of the donors who are talking about safeguarding now and imposing that upon us? Is there a hidden agenda? You know, what are we expected to do? So that terminology can be a real problem. And actually, what we're talking about is making children as safe as possible within the school environment and beyond. And good teachers and communities have been doing that for years. So safeguarding, new frameworks and terms like that can create panic, can create suspicion, and can create problems. So one of the things I think that's important is to untangle that and really sort of narrow it down to being about enabling children to feel safer. I think another challenge can be who's responsible for safeguarding, either within a school environment or within any environment or organisation. A challenge can be that it can be put onto female teachers or female non-teaching staff, and actually it needs to be a whole school approach and go beyond the school. So it's important that the responsibility is held from leadership and beyond leadership at every level within the school community. And then the third problem I'll just highlight is that often when people talk about safeguarding frameworks, etc., it ends up getting boiled down to being a written policy. And the policy can be perfected, it can be great, you can determine your definitions of safeguarding, and then it's put on the shelf and nothing else is done about it. And what safeguarding needs to be a living framework, not a solid document on a shelf. So there needs to be training, there needs to be ongoing recognition of its importance in meetings and in other things that the school does and in the whole school culture. So I'd say that those three were some core problems and core challenges around trying to introduce strong safeguarding practice and improve the well-being of children in schools.
Colin, have you got anything to add to that?
Yes. One of the things often at the teacher level and within schools around safeguarding, and where Jill has just alluded to this thing about terminology, and kind of it creates a system where they don't fully appreciate the breadth of what safeguarding means. So, for example, people often see safeguarding in terms of the physicality, stopping physical abuse or stopping physical neglect, the things that can be seen. And quite often it's seen as something that is done in the school and stops at the school gates, and they don't see the relationship with outside of the school gates. And in particular, what gets overlooked a lot, and you've already mentioned it in your opening, Marc, was that of the mental well-being of a child. It's one of those things that tends to get overlooked. Now, if, for example, we know in areas of fragile context, protracted crisis, and major events such as COVID and previous to COVID, the Ebola virus, these can have very large psychological effects on a child, and so it affects their psychosocial well-being quite severely. And we also know there's lots of evidence and research that shows that this tends to fall disproportionately on women and girls in these situations. So one of the things we did in Ethiopia, because we were aware of this, as the schools returned, and they opened the schools almost as quickly as they closed them. So in advance of it, we did a lot of work with our teachers around recognising the signs within a child that they may be in need of psychosocial support. So lots of work done around that, lots of and simple things. For example, a child that suddenly withdraws into themselves when they used to be very vibrant, some changes of behaviour, and we discussed about how it may manifest itself at different ages as well. And so we looked at some of the causes of it, but importantly, as I said, was recognising the science. And it worked well. Our teachers became aware of it and did manage to identify quite a number of students that they felt were in need of support, and so recommended them to the various support networks that were there that was very beneficial. But if I might, just one thing on this, Mark, one of the often overlooked things, and I will link this back to child safeguarding when people are talking about psychosocial support, is that of the teacher. And it's important to remember that in times of protracted crisis and in wars and situations like COVID, the teachers are subjected to the same situations as the child are. What also happens is there's extra pressures given to the teacher that they have to be the one responsible for maintaining the child's education on top of that. And this can have very severe psychosocial effects on the teacher as well. And it's been well documented over the years that to be in a position where you can offer a child support, you need to be in a safe position and a safe supported position yourself. And so by ignoring the teacher in this, we actually end up letting down the student as well.
I think it's really important, and thank you, Colin, for raising, the teacher as a person in this situation, and the need to make sure they're safe and their well-being is thought about as well. And that might be another aspect of, whole school development or whole school support that's needed. I think what's really interesting about the challenges that you were raising, as well as the challenges, you're also talking about some of the opportunities for resolving them, like having leadership take ownership over this area. And that applies equally to leadership supporting their teaching staff in where they are. And then that puts, you could argue, what's the burden on leadership and how do you support leaders and where does that support come from? So I think there's various levels of support maybe needed in the system to ensure that child well-being is thought about. I was particularly interested in the idea about terminology and, about the recent use of terminology. I think in terms of that as a challenge, is it just a matter of changing the terminology that we're using more broadly in not just conversations internationally, but just how we think, how we conceptualize safeguarding or child safety? Should it just be child safety and well-being? Should we demarcate well-being and mental health, or is mental health part of well-being, and should it be seen that way? Is that part of the teacher education that's needed? So I don't know if you've got a comment on that or not.
I think really it's, you have to have terminology, you have to be able to sort of narrow things down and have a shared understanding of what, at a broader level, at a worldwide level. But I think it comes down to, we often talk about context when we're talking about safeguarding within ChildHope. And it's about understanding the context that you're working within. So one of the first things we would do would be to talk to the people involved about, does safeguarding mean anything to you? What does it mean? Untangle the meaning of safeguarding, and start the conversation there, and start by understanding, what are the legal parameters within that country and within and the frameworks that the school is operating within and the teachers are operating within, who has responsibility for safeguarding within that society or community or school, what are the relationships with people like the police, health, social services, etc., and just kind of enabling the people that you're working with to think about what safeguarding means and to choose really their own terminology to make it fit within the context that they're working in. And that also connects with what Colin was saying about making sure that the people who are most affected participate in this process. So ask the girls and the boys that we're working with what makes them safe, what does it mean to them. Ask the teachers, what their experience is, what they're doing already, because many of them are doing some excellent things, not to assume that we're going in there. The worst thing that we can do is to blunder in with our fancy ideas. And it's to talk to people and work with, from within the school, from what they already have. So talk to them about barriers, existing practice and policy, the social norms that impact on how safeguarding operates within that context and what makes children safe. So it's very much about sort of understanding the context and then maybe bringing in new ideas if there's gaps, but not to come flying in with our terminology and our solutions, because that doesn't tend to work.
And for my part, I entirely agree with the need to understand the local context. Cambridge, when we work in education reform projects in multiple countries, we always think about the context of that project, of the country, of the children, of the teachers, the school leaders, and think, is this the right solution? It's not about us coming in with a solution, like you're saying. It's about working with the stakeholders in the country to say what will work and what's most appropriate, and terminology forms part of that. I just think it's really important that we remind ourselves that context isn't just about what people experience, it's about what people can read and what people can hear as well, and access to the ideas through language is an important part of that. And I think that's what your part sort of spoke to me about, was contextualization. There's multiple layers to it, even as something as simple as the words we choose to use. So in light of that, I'm going to try and avoid the word safeguarding maybe for the rest of our conversation, because just to think about that, because I think that's, so I'll stick to maybe child well-being. On the assumption that teachers are in a good place and they are ready and they're mentally themselves, prepared to support children or identify children with well-being issues, I suppose the question is, what's the benefit of providing teacher professional development on child well-being? What would be what will come out of that? If you've got any comments about that.
Yes, I was commenting there. Actually, that's a huge question.
Yeah.
I know. Because nothing operates in isolation. So for every action that you make there, it creates an action somewhere else, or a reaction. So it is vast, and there's immediate benefits and secondary benefits, and so on and infinitum. The obvious benefit, if I might, is clearly the direct benefit. So kind of greater understanding within a member of staff who's been in training about safeguarding issues, which would lead to increased safety of the child and increased well-being of the child. So that's an obvious one. So for example, within the training, it enables the teachers to be able to distinguish amongst those students or those children in their care who may be at additional risk of abuse and neglect, and the different ways in which they may be vulnerable. And as I mentioned earlier, if done effectively, a teacher will be able to then start to look at telltale signs, so knowing when to react. So what it develops within the teacher is this being consciously aware of a child's well-being, rather than kind of individually drawn to a specific situation. So where it's constantly in a teacher's mind, they're consciously and consistently aware of what is going on. So within that, it kind of develops within the teacher an understanding of the appropriate courses of action they need to take and the appropriate reporting mechanisms. Now, again, here it's not just about reporting that an incident has happened. It's the whole point of safeguarding is to try and prevent an issue from happening. And so often it's about reporting mechanisms that can prevent something happening if you become aware of it. So it's in a way opening people's ears and eyes to kind of be consciously aware of what's happening. But it's also that the safeguarding can develop within the teacher and within the institutions themselves. The communication, the dialogue, that in an effective but importantly a very sensitive way, in a way that supports the child. So I mean, if I might, I'd like to come back onto the issue about sensitive dialogue with the children in a little while. But I just want to talk about some of the unforeseen additional benefits of doing the safeguarding training, creating a safe environment. So if we start with the student, so I'm slightly away here from safeguarding as such, and I want to draw on a much discussed theory, which is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I understand that it's been questioned a lot in recent years, which is fine. However, if we consider some of the more basic needs within his hierarchy, that of the physiological needs and its safety needs, by creating a safe environment for the student, it enables the students to flourish within that environment. So they can engage with their education, they engage with learning. It's something that would be removed for a child if they are subject to safeguarding issues. But equally, as a follow-on from that, this thing about the consciousness with the teachers. The teacher starts to understand themselves, their own actions, and how their own teaching mechanisms could affect a child's safety or a child's perceived safety when they're in the classroom. And so what happens is you then create a level of trust and a level of understanding between the child and the teacher so that the classroom situations can flourish. So back onto the thing of effective communication, to kind of draw on an example from this, from our project in Ethiopia. As part of our safeguarding, we introduced letter link boxes in each of the schools. And what the letter link boxes were boxes where children could post anonymously if they were aware of any safeguarding issues. So it could be anything from within the school around bullying or teachers' behaviours. It could be anything out of the school, such as enforced early marriage. So they would report it anonymously and the school would then act on the situation. And as part of our training with the teachers was about reporting mechanisms and dealing with people sensitively when issues arose. What we found out afterwards is that a number of the incidents reported through these boxes had started to drop, and that concerned us. So as part of our internal monitoring, we went out into the field and we discussed with the students, we discussed with the teachers why it was dropping. And actually what we found is that the number of reports hadn't dropped, but the number of anonymous reports had dropped. And what had happened is because the teachers had developed the sensitivity in the way that they were dealing with the students, the students and the children then felt very comfortable about approaching the school authorities themselves. So they didn't feel the need for anonymity. They could approach their teachers and approach the school principals and actually discuss the issues. So, as I mentioned, the number of incidents dropped within the anonymous reporting, but what it created was a situation of trust and therefore a greater feeling of safety for the children within schools.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good outcome, I think, because this idea of trust and trust between learners and their teachers and senior leaders, and trust also between teachers and senior leaders, I think is really important to make sure the whole thing works. And that leads to a better learning environment. And so, like you say, one of the indirect outcomes of improving child well-being or having a focus on it is you will be supporting the learner progression, learner achievement, and how learners engage with their education. And so I think it's it's not the main reason for doing it. You're thinking of child safety first, but it's a really good benefit of looking at that. I suppose what's really interesting is, with the very clear benefits in place, is how much recognition is there in the system at the moment that child well-being and child protection and mental health of children is something that needs teacher support or needs teacher time to develop, because there's so many pressures, especially as we come out of the pandemic, on teachers and the curriculum, and there's a lot of talk in lots of countries about lost learning, whether that's true or not. There's so much to think about. Is there going to be enough recognition for child safety in the system? I don't know if you've got a comment on that, Jill, or not.
Colin, did you have a comment? You look like you were about to come in. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I mean, if you don't mind.
No, please do.
It actually does relate very nicely to what you talked about earlier, Jill, actually, is recognition still appears to be at policy level. And it's So whereas it tends to be in most policies, it doesn't seem to be mainstreamed throughout the policy. It doesn't seem to be mainstreamed within the approach within schools. And it's seen almost as a tick box exercise. So people will say, for example, 80% of our teachers have achieved training and the remaining 20% are booked in to do training. So it's there, it can be seen as a thing, but it doesn't seem to be acted upon. It doesn't seem to be driven by anywhere, which links into your comments about leadership, Mark, and the importance of leadership there. So I think that's the main issue that I have with it. It's like a lot of the things, they're just built into the policy, and policy isn't driven. It's schools get the education policy and they work through it as a tick box type exercise. Now, and one of the ways of improving it, and I think probably the only way of improving it, is this leadership across all levels. And I mean from the top government level leadership to school leadership, including leadership within the classroom. So let's think about everyone being a leader. And I want to stress here actually the difference between leadership and management. So I'm talking about leadership in its truest sense in terms of rallying people behind the value and driving the things forward. That's the only way these things, I think, is really going to change. I think at government level, they need to start mainstreaming it rather than having safeguarding as a separate heading with a couple of paragraphs that say ensure the safety of the children in your school, and then it moves on to everything else. Continuing professional development at the moment seems to be focused around pedagogy, around teaching methods in a lot of countries, and safeguarding taking a back seat. And I think the way it needs to drive, and this is what I talk about by mainstream and embedding, is whatever the training happens to be about, there should be a safeguarding element within that. So we're talking about new pedagogies, new methods of teaching. How might that affect the students' well-being? Having to suddenly come up with a change of teaching mechanisms. So I know in the UK, I mean, just to draw on sort of different areas, safeguarding became a limiting factor within the inspection process, where how your school or your college works with safeguarding would help define your overall grade, and you couldn't get certain grades if you were falling down on your safeguarding. I'm not suggesting for 1 second that every country in the world should go down the route of policy borrowing and specifically taking the Ofsted model, but it was just a mechanism me highlighting where it had been mainstreamed and it became one of the major things. And so, as you mentioned, it's that leadership. And when we did some leadership workshops in Ethiopia. These were 3 days events and we had principals and we had regional government officials in there. And we talked about safeguarding and in particular corporal punishment. So again, this idea about the teachers can be the ones that are in breach, and therefore the schools are in breach of safeguarding themselves. And as part of this, we just opened the dialogue and we said to them, to the government officials and to the school principals, come out with alternative mechanisms other than corporal punishment. And so with a dialogue, we let in those leadership workshops come up with the solutions themselves. But again, it was drawing the leaders in and getting them involved in the dialogue and getting them to come up with the decisions that they could then take back to their schools.
Yeah. Have you got anything to add, Jill?
Just a small thing. In terms of, I think one of the positive unintended consequences of COVID has been that there's been a real proliferation of resources and online available resources around safeguarding, which is great, but there is something of a gap, I think, between those materials and how much you can get informed online about safeguarding and how to apply them. So fantastic to have so many resources now, but we need to find ways to apply them in different contexts.
So it sounds like, from what you're both saying, from the resources through to this idea of advocacy at different levels of the system to make sure that child well-being is thought about, not just at a policy level, but is taken all the way through the system. There seems to be a thing about finding the right mechanism, finding the right solution for a particular context and making sure it is contextual. So in a certain country, which resource is the most appropriate? What would the advocacy look like at the different levels of the system? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be someone who is the principal, the head teacher. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone on the senior leadership team of a school. It could be a teacher advocate who is leading on what that looks like for a school, but it will need backup from whatever regional structures in place or whatever national structures in place. So that's the sort of sense I'm getting, is that, you know, there is challenges to recognition and to how schools can sort of navigate what's currently out there, but there are solutions. And so thinking about solutions, you already mentioned one, Colin, about, you know, integrating it as much as possible into activity or into other teacher professional development, so such as pedagogical teacher development. Do you have an idea of what that would look like, or is there still a place for some dedicated teacher development or leader development on child well-being? Maybe we need to stop thinking about teacher professional development and start talking about leader professional development. I don't know if you've got a thought on that one.
Yep. Something you look like you were about to.
Oh, no. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think the integrated approach is the solution. Integrated through all the training. The issue if you take specific issue training, often it becomes a bit siloed, and it goes back to the thing about it becomes something that you do on an occasion. And, you know, there are certain things in pedagogy where that may be the case, where you will teach multiplication in a mathematics lesson, for example. Safeguarding cuts across everything. Yeah. And as I mentioned, it doesn't just stop at the school gate. And so it's this understanding and needs to be driven. So it's the kind of, it is that integrated approach, but understanding how wide it is. And that's the only way I feel that we'll get the understanding from everyone about the breadth and the width of understanding of safeguarding, is if in everything that we do, safeguarding becomes part of it. So even if we go to the mechanics of the school, and if the mechanics of the school have team meetings regularly, then it becomes a standard agenda item on team meetings. So that is driven through everything. As you say, have safeguarding officers within schools that are not just somebody who sits in an office as a safeguarding officer, but somebody who goes around talking to the teachers, talking to the children, because often they're the ones that are left out of the policy decisions, and they're the ones who really need to be the biggest stakeholder within the policy decisions. So yeah, I mean, that's the main thing. It's the driven from the leadership, but embedded and mainstream across everything that a school does, and everything that a regional education bureau does as well. So it's mainstreamed at all levels. It's almost a recurring question after everything you say, well, what are the safeguarding implications of that? I don't know if you agree with that, Jill.
Yeah. I mean, just to reinforce really what Colin was saying, that, you know, risk to children and young people can come from anywhere within and outside of the school. So solutions need to be possible from any direction. And I think one of the things that we found during COVID was that actually, because we'd built networks with communities around the schools that we were working in Ethiopia, we were able to adjust quite quickly. I mean, we learned a lot and we obviously made a lot of mistakes, but also we were able to adjust quite quickly. We were able to move the letter link boxes and those mechanisms into the community. We were able to use community spaces. We had the support of community health workers and community volunteers to support the girls in the community because they obviously weren't in school. They worked closely with the teachers, but we really needed those networks and those community networks that went beyond the school in the COVID context. So if we hadn't had those networks and we had to build them from scratch, that would have been a real challenge. But because we had those connections, it really helped.
Yeah. No, and that's really helpful. I mean, I'm aware of time and we're coming to the end of our discussion time. So I'm going to try and summarise some of the key points that I've heard about. So things that I've noted have been things like the importance of contextualising what we talk about with in different countries or even different regions within a country, to make sure that the conversation is relevant to all the people involved, including children, not just, as well as teachers and leaders. I've also noticed the strong focus on leadership at all levels of education, and I need to make sure that there's an embedded approach and leaders take ownership of this. It's not just the job of an individual teacher or teachers as a collective. It's got to be thought about throughout the whole system, child protection and child well-being. I've also noted, the role of implementing policy into practice, and the idea that it's great to have policy, but you need to follow it through and make sure it is having an impact and what that looks like. And there's a definite benefit to providing professional development on this issue, whether that's for teachers or for school leaders or for people in managing the policy shift. There's definitely a need for development. And one of the best cases for development is not just, you're supporting children's safety and their well-being and you're leading to happier children who are safer. You are also going to impact their educational outcomes, and which will help countries on a journey towards increasing achievement of their learners. So I think there's a lot of benefits to focusing on this. But primarily we want safer children. We want to make sure that children everywhere have an enjoyable childhood who aren't at risk of physical abuse or mental illness. We want to make sure children are safe. I'm going to put on the spot for one sort of final question. I'm not going to. I don't particularly want long answers. If there's one thing you would tell a government to do about this issue, about child well-being or mental health, and you do it tomorrow, what would it be? What would be the one thing you would say, this is your priority, you really need to think about it? Go Jill.
I would say to make sure that we're listening to the children and listening to the teachers.
Yeah. Colin?
Well, now because Jill has stolen my one. So it's listening to the children and ensuring it's in the policy, but then mainstreaming that policy through everything.
Yeah. And well, thank you very much for your time. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I'm definitely going to be thinking about my use of the word safeguarding and terminology, and being very careful about who I say, making sure people understand the term before I start using it left, right, and centre. But I think there's been a lot of takeaways from this conversation, and I hope, thank you. I hope you've enjoyed taking part as well.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us. It was great. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Marc. I've enjoyed it.